The gardening tools were neatly packed in my rusty blue hatchback: a vintage spade, some copper plant markers, and a handcrafted watering can I'd inherited from my grandmother, but never used. The address led me to a quiet street in Maplewood, where every house seemed to tell its own story through carefully curated front yards. All except one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When I pulled up to number 43, I was struck by the contrast. While neighboring properties boasted manicured lawns and coordinated flower beds, this house stood behind what could only be described as botanical chaos. Wildflowers erupted between stone pathways, vines climbed haphazardly across a weather-beaten trellis, and fruit trees drooped with unpruned branches. Yet somehow, in its untamed glory, it was the most alive thing on the block. I gathered the supplies and made my way through the garden gate, which creaked like it was sharing secrets with the wind. Before I could knock, a woman emerged from behind an enormous hydrangea bush, garden shears in hand, wearing muddy overalls and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. "You're late," she said, adjusting gardening gloves that were fraying at the fingertips. I checked my watch, confused. "I'm actually 10 minutes early for the delivery." She waved dismissively. "Not for that. You're late for the growing season. Those copper markers should have been in the ground weeks ago if you wanted decent tomatoes this year." She pointed toward a patch of soil that looked freshly turned. "Well, don't just stand there. The sun waits for no gardener." I was about to explain that I was just delivering items she'd purchased online, but something about her authoritative tone made me follow her through the winding garden path. That was the first time I met Eleanor Winters, age 49, owner of what I would later learn was once called the Mapleton Miracle Garden, before it fell into what the neighbors now referred to as that jungle on Oak Street. "I'm just delivering these gardening supplies," I said carefully, placing them on a weather-worn garden table. She examined them with scrutiny, turning the watering can over in her hands. "Hand-hammered copper," she muttered. "They don't make them like this anymore." She glanced at me. "Put it by the rain barrel. And be careful with that spade. It's carbon steel, not that flimsy aluminum nonsense they sell at big box stores." I hesitated. "Where exactly do you want these?" She pointed toward the far end of the garden. "Over there. And while you're at it, those bean poles need straightening. They're leaning like drunken sailors." I laughed. "Sure, I'll get right on that garden rescue mission. Your place is beautiful, by the way. Like organized chaos that somehow works perfectly." She stopped, turned, and tilted her head like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "I'm 49, she said flatly. "And I haven't heard that in years." And that's how it began. Eleanor wasn't cold, exactly. She was focused, precise, protective of her space. She moved through her garden like it was a living entity that required her constant attention and understanding. There was something compelling about her, this combination of stern efficiency and absolute devotion to growing things. I should have left, really. But something about that bizarre exchange made me linger. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was between freelance photography gigs with too much time on my hands. Or maybe, deep down, I was just tired of capturing other people's stories without being part of one myself. So I stayed. I straightened those bean poles, and then I helped her transplant seedlings that were outgrowing their starter pots. She didn't thank me. Instead, she handed me a pair of gloves that were too big and pointed to a patch of stubborn weeds. "You know," I said later, wiping sweat from my forehead, "I didn't actually come here to garden." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "I know. But you stayed anyway." I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to be useful. She showed me how to tell when the soil needed water by its scent, rather than its appearance. I met Oscar, her elderly cat who supervised garden operations from the shade of a massive oak tree. I encountered Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor whose perfectly manicured roses seemed to exist solely to make Eleanor's wild garden look more rebellious in comparison. "That woman," Mrs. Patterson whispered to me over the fence, glancing nervously toward Eleanor. "Used to be someone, you know, before the incident." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Around 4 p.m. we had a visitor. a young woman with clipboard and business cards who introduced herself as from the Maplewood Beautification Committee. Eleanor handled her with polite disinterest, nodding at suggestions about community standards and neighborhood aesthetic cohesion, until the woman eventually retreated through the garden gate, defeated by Eleanor's non-committal hmms. I tried to sell the committee woman on the ecological benefits of native plants. She bought my explanation, just so I'd stop talking, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That evening, Eleanor sat on a mosaic-tiled patio chair, drinking tea from a chipped mug, staring at the setting sun like she was memorizing its exact shade of orange. "You ever feel like you're constantly fighting a losing battle?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "All the time," I said, "usually between waking up and going to bed." She smiled, barely, but it was there, a crack in the fortress. Over the next few days, I kept showing up. I told myself it was because the light in her garden was perfect for photography, which was true. But honestly, I was intrigued. Eleanor had a mystery about her. She was controlled chaos, full of knowledge and principles and regrets she wore like a gardener's calluses, earned and permanent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She told me she once dreamed of creating a botanical sanctuary that would be open to the public. "I saw it in a travel magazine once," she said while pruning a fruit tree. "A place in New Zealand where gardens became therapy. I thought maybe I could bring that here, with medicinal herbs and sensory plants for children with special needs." "Healing gardens?" I asked. "You wouldn't understand," she said, and walked off to battle some aphids on her roses. I started to get used to her brisk instructions, her strange boundaries, her unexpected warmth beneath all the thorns. She wasn't unkind. She just didn't like uncertainty, which made my presence all the more confusing to her. Then there was the blueprint. It was Tuesday afternoon. I was photographing some particularly vibrant dahlias when Eleanor walked in carrying a rolled-up paper, yellowed and creased from handling. "Did you move this?" she asked, her voice tense. "No, it was under the potting bench. Maybe your cat?" She didn't laugh. "Oscar doesn't care about paper." Inside the roll was a detailed garden plan, meticulously drawn with colored pencils and architectural precision. Names of plants, growing conditions, and seasonal rotations were noted in elegant handwriting. At the top, a title: The Healing Hollow, a Sanctuary Garden. "My daughter drew this," she said quietly. "Vivian?" I asked. She'd mentioned her once briefly while explaining why half the garden was devoted to pollinator-friendly plants. "She's in Seattle, landscape architecture." Eleanor's voice dropped. "We don't speak much." "Why?" "She thinks I gave up. On the garden, on myself." The way she said it, matter of fact but with an underlying tremor, made me realize just how alone Eleanor really was in her jungle paradise. That night, I weeded the vegetable beds. For real this time, carefully distinguishing between volunteer, herbs, and actual invaders. She didn't thank me. Instead, she made us gazpacho with tomatoes and cucumbers from the garden and sat next to me on the porch like we'd always done this. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked, the question hanging between us like ripe fruit. I looked at her. The sunset painted her face in soft gold, highlighting silver strands in her dark hair. "I guess I'm drawn to things that grow despite obstacles," I said. "They make me feel less stuck." She looked at me, expression unreadable, and then quietly, so softly I almost missed it, she said, "Maybe I have heard compliments in recent years. I just stopped believing they were meant for me." So I stayed another day and then another. I wasn't sure what I was doing there. I wasn't a gardener. I wasn't being paid. I wasn't even really helping that much, but something in me had started to shift. And though she'd never admit it, something in her had too. The thing about gardens is they don't just grow plants. They grow stories. Unexpected, resilient stories you don't always see coming. Kind of like Eleanor. It had been a week since I jokingly complimented her chaotic garden. Now, I was showing up at her garden gate every morning like it was a job. She still hadn't technically hired me, and I still hadn't technically asked for employment. But there was something about the rhythm of the garden that felt necessary. It kept my mind from drifting back to my cramped apartment, my stalled photography portfolio, my unanswered emails from potential clients. Eleanor didn't say much about my continued presence. She just handed me a mug of herbal tea every morning, different blends from her own herbs. Lemon balm one day, mint the next, and assigned me a task like we'd been doing this for years. Today's task: figure out how to repair the stone pathway without disturbing the time that had established itself between the cracks. The stones shift. When it rains hard, Eleanor said, arms crossed as she stared at the uneven pathway. But the time took 3 years to fill in properly. Everything grows eventually, I muttered. She wasn't amused. She rarely was. But I caught the slight, upward turn of her mouth before she turned away. Oscar showed up around mid-morning, dragging what appeared to be a half-eaten shoelace. He dropped it at my feet like an offering. "He thinks you need better footwear," Eleanor called from across the garden. "Last gardener wore proper boots." "Last gardener?" I asked, but she had already disappeared behind the raspberry bushes. Oscar had become my unofficial garden guide. Or maybe I'd become his human. He followed me as I worked, occasionally batting at leaves or pouncing on unsuspecting beetles. Eleanor seemed to take his approval as a positive sign, though she'd never admit it. "Did you know cats are natural gardeners?" Oscar's other friend, a neighborhood boy named Theo, who often peered through the fence, informed me. "They bury things and then check on them later, like they're planting seeds." "Is that so?" I said, carefully lifting a paving stone. "Yeah, and they always know which plants are safe to eat. Oscar only chews the catnip and catgrass, never the toxic stuff." I looked at Eleanor, who rolled her eyes but didn't contradict him. There was something tender in the way she let Theo share his knowledge, however fanciful. Later that afternoon, a woman arrived wearing an expensive-looking linen dress and carrying a designer tote bag. She paused at the garden entrance, took a deep breath as if preparing for battle, then walked in with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Her name was Diane, and she was a local restaurant owner looking for a garden to supply her farm-to-table establishment. She'd heard about Eleanor's garden from someone at the farmer's market. "I need edible flowers," she announced. "Nasturtiums, borage, violets, things that photograph well on plates." Eleanor squinted. "For eating or for decoration?" "Both, obviously," Diane said, sweeping her hand dramatically. "People eat with their eyes first." I didn't know how she did it, but Eleanor found her an abundance of edible blooms. Diane laid them out on the garden table, photographing them with her phone and making excited notes in a small leather notebook. Clark wandered in through the back gate while we were wrapping up Diane's order. A lanky teenager with perpetually untied shoelaces and a passionate interest in climate science. He often stopped by after school to check on what he called the most sustainable ecosystem in Maplewood. "The bees are back," he whispered to me, eyes wide with excitement. "The ones everyone thought had abandoned the neighborhood." He pointed toward a flourishing lavender bush where, indeed, several honeybees were busily working. "Ms. Winters created an oasis when everyone else was putting in turf and synthetic fertilizers." "The bees were always here," Eleanor said, overhearing us. "People just stopped looking for them." That evening, we sat on the garden bench, drinking cold hibiscus tea. Eleanor had been quieter than usual all afternoon, ever since Diane had asked about supplying her restaurant regularly. "You ever feel like you've been hiding something beautiful just because you're afraid people won't treat it with care?" she asked. I looked at her. The evening light filtered through the oak leaves, dappling her face. "All the time," I said honestly. "Every time I don't share a photograph I've taken." She nodded slowly. "I used to supply 3 restaurants and the weekend farmer's market," she said. "People came from 2 counties away for my heirloom tomatoes." "What happened?" Eleanor was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. "Life happened," she finally said. "Some things died. Others just stopped growing for a while." I wanted to ask more, but something in her expression told me she'd shared enough for one day. Instead, I showed her some of the photos I'd taken of her garden over the past week. Close-ups of dew on spiderwebs, the perfect spiral of an unfurling fern, the contrast of rough bark against delicate petals. "You see things differently," she said, studying each image. "Most people just see the mess." "I see the story," I replied. "Every garden has one." The next morning, I arrived to find Eleanor arguing with someone on the phone. Her back was turned, but I could hear the tension in her voice. No, Vivian, I don't need you to fly across the country because someone said my garden looks nice. A pause. No, I'm not being stubborn. I'm being realistic. The call ended with a sharp click. Eleanor stood by the rain barrel for a long time, staring at the phone like it might suddenly offer answers. Your daughter? I asked gently. She nodded, then said, She thinks I can't handle things on my own. Can you? Eleanor didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Around 5 p.m., the stone pathway was finally repaired. Theo cheered like I'd discovered a new plant species. Mrs. Patterson peered over the fence and reluctantly admitted it looked structurally sound. Eleanor just stared at it, silent. That path, she said slowly, once led to a small pond with water lilies and a bench where my husband would read poetry on Sunday afternoons. Sounds peaceful. It was purposeful, she said. But there was something in her tone, something wistful, something aching. And then with a slow exhale she added, I don't miss him. I miss believing gardens could heal everything. That night, after everyone had gone, we sat out front watching fireflies begin their evening dance. Theo had left a child's astronomy book he'd brought to show Eleanor, and I flipped through it idly. Eleanor got cancer, I read from the Zodiac section. It says she's in for an unexpected change that will reconnect her with her past. I hope that means rain, she muttered. The forecast has been wrong all week. Oscar appeared from under a hydrangea and meowed insistently. The irrigation system is acting up again, Eleanor translated. I looked at her. The porch light flickered once, then glowed steady, illuminating her profile against the darkening garden. I'm not used to people sticking around, she said. Me neither. I don't know if Eleanor will ever create her healing garden sanctuary. I don't know if she'll ever reconnect with Vivian or if she'll ever stop seeing every unexpected kindness as a potential disappointment. But I do know this. That blueprint, the one for the healing hollow, now sits on her potting bench where she can see it every day. And though she hasn't said anything about it, I've noticed she started clearing a section in the back corner of the garden, measuring distances with careful steps. I'm still not sure what my role is in all this. I'm not a gardener by trade. I'm a photographer who stumbled into someone else's story and decided to stay a while. But there's something about watching Eleanor work, her hands moving with certainty while her eyes hold doubt, that makes me want to capture every moment of this unfolding narrative. There are certain scents that stay with you. The petrichor of rain on dry soil, the sharp sweetness of tomato vines on your fingers, the subtle perfume of night-blooming jasmine. But nothing prepared me for the overwhelming fragrance of hundreds of lilies blooming at once, especially when they appeared in a garden that hadn't contained lilies the day before. That's how this chapter began, with the mysterious appearance of stargazer lilies arranged in a perfect circle at the far end of Eleanor's garden, especially when no one had planted them. Eleanor, I called out, nearly dropping my camera. Did you plant these overnight? She emerged from the greenhouse, hair twisted into a messy bun, soil already embedded under her fingernails despite the early hour. When she saw the lilies, she froze. The watering can slipped from her hand and clattered against the stone path. That's not possible, she whispered. I moved closer to the flowers, their pink and white petals unfurled like they'd been blooming. For days, not hours. They look pretty established to me. Eleanor approached cautiously, as if the flowers might vanish if she moved too quickly. She knelt beside them, her fingers hovering above the blooms without touching them. These are stargazer lilies, she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. They were Vivian's favorite. We used to grow them together. Could she have planted them? As a surprise? Eleanor shook her head. Vivian hasn't been here in 3 years. Her eyes narrowed as she examined the soil. Besides, lilies don't bloom overnight. These would have been visible as stems for weeks before flowering. That's when we noticed the note, a small card, partially buried beneath one of the plants. Eleanor pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly. The card was blank except for a small drawing of a compass rose in the corner. The Garden Society, she murmured, more to herself than to me. I was about to ask what she meant when Theo's face appeared above the fence line, his eyes wide with excitement. Whoa! Magic flowers, he exclaimed, scrambling over rather than using the gate. Did garden fairies bring them? Eleanor quickly tucked the card into her pocket. No such thing as fairies, she said firmly, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Just someone playing games. But the lilies were just the beginning of what would become the strangest week of my unexpected gardening career. By Wednesday, Eleanor had received 3 more mysterious gifts. A hand-carved wooden bench that appeared near the herb spiral, a vintage copper weather vane shaped like a hummingbird, and a collection of rare heritage seeds delivered in unmarked envelopes. Each came with the same compass rose symbol, but no other identification. Eleanor pretended to be annoyed, but I caught her sitting on the bench late one evening, running her fingers over the intricate carvings of vines and flowers that decorated its arms. It looks handmade, I observed, joining her with 2 mugs of chamomile tea. It is, she said. Each garden society member has a craft. Some build, some grow, some preserve. She stopped abruptly, as if she'd said too much. This garden society sounds intriguing. Are they local? Eleanor took a long sip of tea before answering. They're everywhere and nowhere. People who believe gardens are more than decorations or food sources, that they're essential to healing the world. She paused. I used to be one of them. What happened? She stood up, ending the conversation. The past happened, and now I have Japanese beetles to battle before they destroy my roses. Are you helping or asking questions all day? I helped, of course, but my curiosity was growing faster than any plant in her garden. That evening, while Eleanor was distracted by a phone call, I noticed a leather-bound book on her potting bench that hadn't been there before. It was old and weather-worn, with the now familiar compass rose embossed on its cover. I shouldn't have looked, but the photographer in me couldn't resist. Inside were pressed flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs, a chronicle of gardens around the country. But what caught my eye were the photos of a younger Eleanor standing proudly in a much more expansive version of her current garden. In one image, she stood beside a man with kind eyes and a teenage girl who had Eleanor's determined chin. Her family, I presumed. They were surrounded by people of all ages, all wearing green aprons with the compass rose emblem. That was the inaugural meeting of the Midwest chapter? Eleanor's voice came from behind me. I jumped, nearly dropping the precious album. 15 years ago, before everything changed. Instead of anger at my snooping, I saw resignation in her eyes, maybe even relief, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask about the life she'd left behind. What was it like? I asked gently. She sat down on a garden stool, suddenly looking every one of her 49 years. It was purpose, she said simply. We restored abandoned lots, created community gardens in food deserts, taught children how to grow their own vegetables. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. We believed we were changing the world, one seed at a time. That sounds amazing, I said. Why would you walk away from that? The question hung between us like morning mist. Eleanor's hands, usually so steady, twisted together in her lap. My husband, James, was the true visionary, she finally said. He believed gardens could heal trauma, bring communities together, even reduce crime. When he died, suddenly, heart attack, everyone looked to me to continue his work. She took a deep breath. But I couldn't. I just withdrew. The garden became smaller, just like my world. Before I could respond, there was a commotion at the garden gate. Clark burst in, breathing hard like he'd been running. Ms. Winters, did you hear? The city council approved the community development plan. They're going to bulldoze the abandoned railway lot. Eleanor blinked, momentarily confused by the interruption. The old railway garden? But that's protected land. Clark shook his head frantically. Not anymore. Some developer convinced them it would be better as a parking structure. They vote on final approval next week. I watched as something shifted in Eleanor's expression, like a plant turning toward unexpected sunlight. She stood up, shoulders straightening. Well, she said with newfound crispness, we'll just have to see about that. The next morning, Eleanor's kitchen table had transformed into command central. Maps, documents, and old photographs covered every surface. She moved with a purpose I hadn't seen before, making calls, sending emails, digging through files. The railway garden was our first major project, she explained between calls. 5 acres of abandoned industrial land that we transformed into a food forest and community space. James always said it was living proof that nature could reclaim what humans discarded. I studied a photo of the space, a lush, wild-looking garden with winding paths, fruit trees, and gathering areas. It's beautiful. Why would anyone want to replace it with parking? Money, Eleanor said simply. Always money. The developer probably donated to campaign funds. She sighed. The garden hasn't been properly maintained since I stopped leading the society. It probably looks neglected now. Then let's go see it, I suggested. I can take pictures, document what's there. Maybe we can show people what would be lost. Eleanor hesitated, and I realized she hadn't left her own garden in quite some time. The thought of returning to the project she'd abandoned clearly terrified her. But something, determination or perhaps guilt, won out. Yes, she agreed. Let's go now, before I change my mind. The railway garden was tucked behind Maplewood's industrial district, accessible through a narrow passage between 2 old brick buildings. From the street, you'd never know it existed. As we approached, Eleanor slowed her steps. It's been 3 years, she murmured. Since James died, since I was here. I offered my hand, and to my surprise, she took it. Together, we stepped through the passage into what felt like another world. The garden had indeed suffered from neglect. Paths were overgrown, structures weathered, invasive plants beginning to overtake some areas. But the bones were still there. The thoughtful design, the diverse ecosystem, the sense of sanctuary. Nature was resilient, continuing its work even without human guidance. Eleanor moved through the space like someone revisiting a childhood home, touching plants, murmuring names, noting what had thrived and what had struggled. I photographed everything: the wild beauty, the innovative water collection systems, the handmade signs with botanical information. Even in its untended state, the garden hummed with life. Birds darting between trees, bees working the flowering weeds, butterflies dancing over tall grasses. It's still here, Eleanor said wonderingly. All of it, just waiting. We spent hours there, Eleanor gradually relaxing into the role of tour guide, showing me design features I might have missed. The subtle berms that directed rainwater, the companion plantings that reduced pests naturally, the careful placement of trees to create microclimates. James designed most of it, she explained. But everyone contributed. That herb spiral was my creation. The stone circle was built by a stonemason with arthritis who said working with the earth eased his pain. As the afternoon light softened, we sat on a bench overlooking what had once been a demonstration vegetable garden. Why didn't anyone continue the work after you stepped back? I asked. Eleanor sighed. The Garden Society tries to honor members' grief. No one wanted to push me, and without James's charisma or my organizational skills, she shrugged. People tried, but it's hard to maintain momentum without leadership. Including Vivian? I asked carefully. Eleanor's face tightened. Vivian wanted to continue. She was only 17 when James died, but she had his vision, his passion. We fought about it. Terribly. I couldn't bear to see her pouring herself into this place that had taken her father from us. She looked away. I forbade her from taking over, said she needed to focus on college. In reality, I couldn't face coming here with her instead of him. And that's why she moved across the country? She said I was betraying everything Dad believed in. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. Maybe she was right. On the drive back, Eleanor was quiet, staring out the window at the passing neighborhoods. I wondered if she was regretting our excursion, but when we pulled up to her house, she turned to me with clear eyes. Thank you, she said simply. I needed to see it again. That night, something shifted. Eleanor brought out photo albums, garden journals, even old VHS tapes of Garden Society events. She showed me pictures of Vivian as a child, planting her first seeds, James giving workshops on permaculture, herself younger and smiling more freely, leading tours through flourishing community gardens. We were a team, she said. The 3 of us. James had the vision. I had the organizational skills. And Vivian, even as a child, had this innate understanding of how things grew together. You still have those skills, I pointed out. But not the heart, she said softly. Not since James. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I'd seen her heart in every careful tending of her garden, every patient explanation to Theo, every moment of genuine connection she'd allowed herself despite her fears. But I sensed she wasn't ready to hear it. The next morning, Eleanor was up before dawn, her kitchen table now covered with fresh paper, colored pencils, and drafting tools. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice me until I placed a mug of tea at her elbow. "What's all this?" I asked. "A proposal," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "If we can show the council an alternative plan for the railway garden, one that serves the community better than a parking structure, we might have a chance." Peered over her shoulder at the detailed renderings taking shape. She'd envisioned a revitalized space with dedicated areas for community vegetable plots, native plant education, children's gardens, and meditation spaces. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "But can you put this together in time for the council meeting?" "Not alone," she admitted. "I need help." Those 3 words, so simple yet so difficult for her to say, marked another turning point. By afternoon, Eleanor's garden had become an impromptu headquarters. Mrs. Patterson, surprisingly, was the first to volunteer, bringing over her extensive collection of gardening magazines for reference material. Theo brought his entire class, from the elementary school, armed with crayons and construction paper to create Save Our Garden posters. Clark activated his environmental club, organizing an online petition that quickly gathered signatures. Even Diane, the restaurant owner, returned, offering to cater the council meeting with food featuring ingredients that could be grown in the revitalized garden. "Farm to table will be literal," she declared. "Imagine the marketing potential." Most surprising was the steady stream of visitors wearing green aprons with compass rose emblems, members of the Garden Society, emerging from hibernation just like Eleanor herself. They arrived throughout the day, bringing plants, tools, expertise, and support. "We've been waiting," an older woman named Grace told Eleanor, clasping her hands warmly. "Waiting for you to be ready." "I abandoned everyone," Eleanor said, voice tight with emotion. "The garden, the society, our mission." "You took the time you needed," Grace corrected gently. "The seeds were dormant, not dead." As the day progressed, I watched Eleanor transform. The rigid, defensive woman who had greeted me with suspicion was slowly giving way to someone more fluid, more connected. She still issued direct commands and maintained high standards, but now there was a current of joy beneath her efficiency. By evening, the plans were nearly complete, the presentation materials organized, and a strategy in place for the council meeting. As people began to disperse with promises to return tomorrow, Eleanor stood in her garden, looking both exhausted and exhilarated. "I'd forgotten," she said quietly as we cleaned up the last of the materials. "Forgotten what?" "How it feels to be part of something larger than myself." She gestured toward her garden. "All this, it's been my hiding place, my beautiful, complicated hiding place." I thought about how I'd stumbled into her world by accident, delivering garden tools I'd never intended to use myself, making a joke about her chaotic garden, falling into this unexpected story. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with wrong turns. "You know what James used to say?" Eleanor continued, her voice warming with memory. "Gardens aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to be alive." I think I've been chasing perfection when I should have been embracing life. As if on cue, Oscar emerged from beneath a flowering shrub, a small toad hopping alongside him in perfect companionship. Eleanor laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that seemed to surprise even her. "Life finds its way," she said, watching the odd pair explore the garden path. "Even when we try to control it." That night, a summer storm rolled in, powerful and cleansing. Eleanor and I sat on her covered porch, watching lightning illuminate the garden in flashes of silver. The plants swayed and danced in the wind, accepting the storm as just another part of their existence. "Do you worry about damage?" I asked, as a particularly strong gust bent the taller perennials almost to the ground. Eleanor shook her head. Plants that never face wind develop weak stems. They need to be tested to grow stronger. She gave me a sideways glance. People too, sometimes. The next morning revealed both destruction and beauty. Branches down, flowers bedraggled, but also a freshness, a renewed vibrancy to everything. Eleanor surveyed her domain with practical eyes. "Nature's pruning," she declared, handing me garden shears. "Let's clean up." As we worked side by side, I realized how much had changed in the short time since I'd delivered those garden tools. I'd arrived a solitary photographer, drifting between assignments, capturing other people's stories, but never quite part of them. Now I was elbow-deep in soil, invested in saving a community garden I'd never known existed a week ago, and somehow tangled in the life of a remarkable woman who was emerging from her own winter. "You're thinking too loudly," Eleanor said, interrupting my reflection. "Penny for your thoughts?" "I was just wondering," I said, carefully pruning a storm-damaged rose. "What happens after the council meeting? Win or lose?" Eleanor straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "If we win, there's a garden to restore. If we lose—" She paused, considering. "Well, there are other abandoned spaces in Maplewood. Other possibilities." "And Vivian?" I asked gently. Eleanor's hand stilled on the plant she was tending. "I called her last night," she admitted. "Left a message about what we're doing." "That's a start." "It's terrifying," she corrected, but with the hint of a smile. "Almost as terrifying as complimenting my chaotic garden that first day." "Best reckless comment I ever made," I said lightly. She looked at me then, really looked at me, with eyes that had begun to relearn hope. "I'm 49, she said with deliberate emphasis, "and I'm finally starting to hear the compliments again." As we continued working, a delivery truck pulled up to the garden gate. The driver carried a large, carefully wrapped package that he handed to Eleanor with a tablet to sign. "I didn't order anything," she said, frowning. "Sender is listed as V. Winters, Seattle," the driver replied, checking his screen. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the package. We carried it to the garden table, where she carefully unwrapped the protective layers. Inside was a beautifully crafted model of a garden. Not just any garden, but a miniature version of the railway garden as it could be, based on the plans we'd been developing. A note was tucked inside. "Mom, heard you're finally ready to grow again. This is how I've always seen it, how Dad saw it, how you taught me to see it. I'm booking a flight. Love, V." Eleanor stood perfectly still, one hand covering her mouth, the other tracing the tiny paths and structures of the model garden. Then, without warning, she began to laugh, a sound of surprise and release and joy that seemed to ripple through the storm-washed garden. "She remembers," Eleanor whispered. "Everything we taught her, everything we believed." I looked at the model more closely and noticed something remarkable. Woven throughout the miniature landscape were tiny copper markers, identical to the ones I'd delivered on that first day. Each labeled a plant or feature, creating a map of possibilities. "Copper markers should have been in the ground weeks ago if you wanted decent tomatoes," I quoted with a smile. Eleanor laughed again, the sound freer now. "I was quite rude to you, wasn't I?" "Memorable," I corrected. "Definitely memorable." She carefully set the model in a place of honor on her potting bench, where the morning sun caught the copper markers and made them glow like promises. "Well," she said, with newfound decisiveness, "we have exactly 3 days to save a garden and prepare for my daughter's visit. Are you helping or just standing there?" I picked up my garden shears with a flourish. Wouldn't miss it for the world. And so we continued, clearing storm debris, finalizing presentation materials, welcoming the steady stream of allies who came to help. The garden hummed with purpose and possibility, no longer a hiding place, but a launching pad. There are certain moments that change everything. A chance delivery, a casual compliment, a storm that both damages and cleanses. For Eleanor, it was rediscovering that gardens aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to be shared. For me, it was learning that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones you stumble into by accident. That evening, as golden hour bathed the garden in warm light, I captured a photograph of Eleanor standing amid her beloved plants, face tilted upward, eyes closed, simply breathing it all in. The image caught something transcendent. A woman no longer afraid of growth, even when it came with the risk of loss. "Did you get the shot?" she asked without opening her eyes. "I think so," I replied. "But I'm not done yet." "Good," she said, finally looking at me with clear, present eyes. "Neither am I." That's how I found myself in City Hall on a sweltering Tuesday evening, surrounded by garden enthusiasts, environmental activists, and one very determined 49-year-old woman who looked nothing like the reclusive gardener I'd met just 2 weeks earlier. Eleanor had traded her muddy overalls for a crisp linen dress the color of sage leaves. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, adorned with a single fresh gardenia from her garden. She looked formidable, focused, and, most surprisingly, at peace. "Nervous?" I whispered as we waited for the council meeting to begin. "Terrified," she replied with unexpected honesty, but the right kind of terrified. She glanced around at the packed chamber, like watching a seedling break through concrete. It shouldn't work, but sometimes it does anyway. The council members filed in, 5 men and women in business, attire who looked mildly surprised at the overflowing attendance. The developers' team sat confidently at a designated table, armed with glossy presentations and economic impact reports. Our side had Eleanor, a scale model of the garden renovation, my photographs, and approximately 70 passionate supporters wearing green ribbons. "This should be interesting," muttered Clark, who had somehow procured a press pass from his school newspaper and was taking studious notes. The meeting began with standard procedures: minutes approved, agenda reviewed. Then the developer took the floor, a smooth-talking man in an expensive suit who referred to the railway garden as the abandoned lot, and spoke enthusiastically about revitalizing underutilized urban space with a state-of-the-art parking facility and potential future commercial development. His presentation was polished, full of economic projections and tax revenue estimates. Several council members nodded appreciatively as he described job creation potential and improved property values. "Any questions for Mr. Reynolds before we hear from the opposition?" asked the council chair, a woman with skeptical eyes and a neutral expression. "Just to clarify," said a council member, "the space in question is currently unused, correct? Just sitting there?" Mr. Reynolds smiled. "Essentially abandoned, yes. Some unauthorized plantings, but no formal use or maintenance for several years." I felt Eleanor tense beside me. "Unauthorized plantings," she whispered indignantly. "That's heritage fruit trees and native pollinator habitats he's dismissing." When it was finally our turn, Eleanor approached the podium with straight shoulders and steady hands. For a moment, I worried that her newfound confidence might falter under the formal scrutiny of the council and the developers' team. But then, she began to speak, and I realized I had underestimated her yet again. "My name is Eleanor Winters," she began, her voice clear and composed. 15 years ago, my late husband James and I, along with the Maplewood Garden Society, transformed an industrial wasteland into what became known as the Railway Garden. What Mr. Reynolds calls unauthorized plantings include 57 varieties of native plants that support local wildlife, 32 heritage fruit trees that produce free food for the community, and a living laboratory that has educated thousands of Maplewood children about ecosystems and sustainable agriculture. She gestured to me, and I advanced the slides showing my photographs, close-ups of beneficial insects on native flowers, children's painted rocks hidden along garden paths, an elderly man sitting peacefully on a handmade bench. "The garden hasn't been abandoned," Eleanor continued. "It's been neglected. By the city, yes, but also by me." She paused, and I saw something remarkable in her face. Vulnerability transformed into strength. "After my husband died, I withdrew from the garden and the society. That was my failure, and one I intend to correct." She unveiled our proposal then, not just to save the garden, but to revitalize it as a community education center, with dedicated spaces for school, programs, therapeutic horticulture for veterans and seniors, and demonstration plots for sustainable urban agriculture. "Maplewood doesn't need another parking structure," she said firmly. "It needs green spaces that heal, teach, and bring people together." Questions from the council followed, about maintenance costs, volunteer coordination, educational programming. Eleanor answered each with surprising thoroughness, occasionally deferring to society members with specific expertise. I watched the council's expression shift from polite attention to genuine interest. Then Mr. Reynolds requested a rebuttal. "This is all very idealistic," he said smoothly. "But we're talking about prime development land worth millions in potential revenue. These gardening hobbyists are asking you to forego serious economic opportunity for what amounts to a community vegetable patch." I felt a ripple of anger move through our group. But before anyone could respond, the doors at the back of the chamber opened. A tall young woman entered, pulling a carry-on suitcase, still wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who's just stepped off a plane. Her dark hair was cut in a modern, asymmetrical style, and she wore professional attire with hiking boots, an unusual combination that somehow worked perfectly. Eleanor's breath caught. "Vivian," she whispered. The newcomer walked directly to the podium. "My name is Vivian Winters," she announced. "I'm a landscape architect, specializing in urban renewal through green infrastructure. I've just flown in from Seattle, where I've spent the past 3 years designing spaces that serve both economic and environmental needs." She opened her laptop and quickly connected it to the projection system. "With the council's permission, I'd like to present some relevant case studies." For the next 15 minutes, Vivian showcased projects from across the country, former industrial sites transformed into community spaces that actually increased surrounding property values, created green jobs, and improved public health outcomes. She presented data on decreased crime rates, improved air quality, and reduced healthcare costs in neighborhoods with accessible green spaces. "The choice between economic development and environmental stewardship is a false dichotomy," she concluded. "The most successful cities integrate both. Maplewood has an opportunity to be a leader in this approach, building on a foundation that already exists at the Railway Garden." The council chamber hummed with renewed energy. Mr. Reynolds looked considerably less confident as the council chair called for a brief recess to consider both proposals. Eleanor moved through the crowd toward her daughter, stopping just a few feet away. They regarded each other across the small distance, so physically similar yet separated by years of misunderstanding and grief. "You came," Eleanor said simply. Vivian nodded. "I saw your message, and then I got a call from someone named Grace who said you were blooming again." Eleanor laughed softly. "The Garden Society Gossip Network remains undefeated." "Your proposal is good," Vivian said, professional assessment mixing with personal pride. "The therapeutic garden section especially." "I had a good teacher," Eleanor replied. "Two, actually." The moment stretched between them, fragile and hopeful. Then, simultaneously, they stepped forward and embraced, awkwardly at first, then with increasing certainty. I captured the moment with my camera, knowing instinctively that this reconciliation was as important as any garden. When the council reconvened, their decision was unexpected but promising: a 6-month conditional approval for our garden renewal plan, with regular progress reviews and the possibility of reconsidering the development proposal if specific milestones weren't met. "You have until spring," the council chair told Eleanor directly. "Show us this garden can truly serve the community as you've described." It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a chance, a season to prove what was possible. As we gathered our materials, the developer approached, looking more thoughtful than defeated. "Ms. Winters," he said, addressing both Eleanor and Vivian, "your presentation was educational. Perhaps we should discuss ways to integrate green space into future development plans." Vivian handed him her business card without hesitation. "I'd be happy to consult. Sustainable development is the future, Mr. Reynolds." Outside City Hall, our group celebrated with impromptu hugs and excited planning discussions. Grace passed around homemade lavender cookies while Clark interviewed everyone for his newspaper article. Theo drew elaborate pictures of what he thought the renovated garden should include, featuring a surprising number of dinosaur topiaries. Amidst the jubilation, I found Eleanor sitting quietly on a bench, watching her daughter charm the crowd with her professional expertise and natural warmth. "She's remarkable," I said, joining her. "She always was," Eleanor replied. "I just got too afraid to watch her grow." She turned to me with eyes that held both sadness and hope. "Did you know that after a forest fire, certain seeds actually need the heat to germinate? They can lie dormant for decades, waiting for the very thing most plants fear. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, from a random delivery to a city council showdown, from grief-stricken isolation to community reconnection, all sparked by a casual compliment about a beautiful garden. "What happens now?" I asked. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and smoothed the worry lines from her face. "Now we garden," she said simply, "but not alone. Never alone again." The next morning dawned cool and clear. Perfect weather for the massive undertaking ahead. By 8 a.m., Eleanor's once private sanctuary had transformed into project headquarters. Garden Society members arrived with tools, seedlings, and decades of collective wisdom. Neighborhood volunteers showed up with refreshments and enthusiasm, if not expertise. Even Mrs. Patterson appeared with her garden club, all wearing matching gloves and visors. In the midst of this organized chaos, Eleanor and Vivian stood over spread-out plans on the garden table, heads bent together in concentrated discussion. Their similarities were striking. The same focused intensity, the same graceful hands gesturing as they spoke, the same connection to the earth beneath their feet. But where Eleanor's approach was intuitive and experience-based, Vivian brought technical knowledge and innovative thinking. "If we incorporate rainwater catchment here," Vivian was saying, pointing to the blueprint, "we can reduce city water usage by almost 40%. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. The old apple tree would provide natural shade for the collection. Barrels, too. They worked in remarkable synchrony, occasionally disagreeing but clearly respecting each other's perspective. I photographed them from a distance, capturing this delicate rebuilding of both a garden and a relationship. Clark appeared at my elbow, notepad in hand. "Ms. Winters says you're documenting everything for the council presentation," he said earnestly. "Can I help? I'm thinking of becoming a photojournalist." I handed him my backup camera. "Focus on the people, not just the plants," I advised. "Gardens are really about relationships, between humans and nature, but also between each other." He nodded solemnly and wandered off to photograph Theo, who was solemnly introducing earthworms to their new home in a freshly built compost bin. By midday, we had organized into teams with specific focuses: site clearing, soil preparation, structural repairs. I found myself leading the documentation group, teaching volunteers to photograph before stages of each area and record progress, notes that would eventually become part of our report to the council. During a water break, I overheard Eleanor and Vivian in a quieter conversation, seated on the new bench in a shady corner. "I should have called more," Vivian was saying. "Not just angry texts on Dad's birthday." Eleanor shook her head. "I should have answered when you did call. Grief made me a coward, Viv. I couldn't bear to see him in you. Your passion, your vision. It hurt too much." "And now?" Eleanor reached out to touch a flowering vine that climbed the nearby trellis. "Now I'm starting to remember that growth comes after loss. It's supposed to. That's the whole point of a garden." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Vivian asked, "So what's the story with the photographer?" Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly. "He delivered some garden tools, made a joke, stayed." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" "Nothing's just like that," Eleanor replied. "But sometimes people arrive exactly when the soil is ready for new planting." I moved away before they noticed me, pretending intense interest in a butterfly bush while my heart beat a little faster than necessary. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Mr. Reynolds, the developer, dressed in casual clothes and looking genuinely curious. Vivian greeted him professionally, giving him a tour of the work already underway. To everyone's surprise, he rolled up his sleeves and joined a team removing invasive species from what would become the children's garden. "My grandfather was a farmer," he explained when he caught me watching him. "I haven't had dirt under my nails in 30 years. He looked around at the diverse group working together. "This is good community building. Perhaps we've been approaching development too narrowly." By sunset, the transformation was already visible, not just in the cleared paths and freshly turned soil, but in the connections forming between volunteers of all ages and backgrounds. Diane from the restaurant was discussing seasonal menus with a retired botanist. Theo was learning about tool maintenance from an elderly Garden Society member. Clark was interviewing everyone for what had apparently evolved from a school newspaper article into a documentary project. As darkness fell, someone produced solar lanterns, creating pools of warm light throughout the garden. Impromptu music began, a guitar, a harmonica, voices joining in familiar songs. Under the spreading branches of the old apple tree, a community was remembering how to grow together. Eleanor found me photographing this magical scene from the shadows. "You should join them," she said softly. "I'm better behind the camera," I replied, capturing moments rather than making them. She studied me with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing in her garden, or apparently, in people. "You've been behind the camera in your own life for too long," she observed, "always documenting, rarely participating." The insight was uncomfortable in its accuracy. "Old habits," I murmured. "Growth requires change," she countered, then softened. "At least that's what this stubborn gardener is finally learning." Before I could respond, Vivian called for everyone's attention. Standing on an overturned crate, she thanked the volunteers and outlined the next day's objectives. She spoke with natural leadership that reminded me of what Eleanor had said about her husband, James, the ability to inspire others with a vision of what could be. "This garden," Vivian concluded, looking around at the lantern-lit faces, "was never just about plants. My father used to say that gardens are acts of faith, in the future, in nature's resilience, and in our capacity to nurture rather than just consume." Her voice caught slightly. "He would be amazed to see all of you here, continuing that faith." As the gathering began to disperse, promises of returning tomorrow floating in the evening air, I found myself helping Eleanor collect empty water bottles and stray tools. "Your daughter is carrying on your husband's legacy beautifully," I observed. Eleanor nodded, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. "And adding her own chapters to the story. That's how it should be." She paused, considering something. "You know, James had a saying when new gardeners would get overwhelmed by mistakes or setbacks. He'd tell them, 'A garden is never finished and never perfect. That's why it's worth showing up for.'" She looked at me directly then, in the gentle glow of the lanterns. People are like that too, I think. Worth showing up for, especially in their unfinished state. The words hung between us, an invitation and a challenge. Before I could formulate a response, Theo ran up with an urgent garden emergency. A toad had taken up residence in his abandoned sneaker. The moment passed, but her words remained, taking root like a persistent seed. Later that night, long after the volunteers had departed, I found myself unable to sleep. The images from the day kept replaying in my mind. Hands in soil, laughter, across generations, the tentative rebuilding of a mother-daughter relationship. And through it all, Eleanor, transformed, yet essentially unchanged, like a plant finding its way back to the light after a long shadow. On impulse, I drove back to her house, intending to leave a note with some printed photographs for the next day's planning session. The garden was quiet under a nearly full moon, silver light turning the familiar landscape into something magical and mysterious. To my surprise, I found Eleanor still awake, sitting on her porch steps with Oscar curled beside her, both contemplating the moonlit garden. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, not seeming particularly surprised by my appearance. I shook my head, too many thoughts growing wild. She smiled at the gardening metaphor. "Pull up some porch. The night garden is a different world entirely." I joined her on the steps, and we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the chorus of cicadas and watching fireflies create living constellations among the plants. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier," I finally admitted. "About showing up for people in their unfinished state." Eleanor nodded. "Gardeners understand imperfection better than most. We know that beauty coexists with decay, that strength often follows vulnerability." She glanced at me. "But it's easier with plants than people, isn't it?" "Much easier," I agreed. "Plants don't have complicated histories or defense mechanisms or fears about the future. Don't they?" she challenged gently. "The mimosa that folds its leaves when touched, the tree that grows stronger bark after a fire, the seed that won't germinate until it's been through the coldest winter." She shook her head. "I think we understand plants better because we observe them without judgment. We allow them their natural responses to trauma and change." Her words resonated uncomfortably with my own tendency to keep people at a distance, to document rather than participate, to deliver garden tools but never plant my own seeds. When James died, Eleanor continued softly, I treated my grief like an invasive species, something to be contained and isolated. I walled off my garden, my community, even my daughter. I thought I was protecting what remained. She gestured toward the moonlit expanse of growing things. But gardens don't thrive in isolation. Neither do people. And now? I asked. Now I'm learning to grow differently, she said. To accept help, to share the work, to trust the process even when I can't control the outcome. She turned to face me directly. What about you? What keeps you behind the camera instead of in the frame? The question pierced through my carefully maintained distance. In the silver moonlight, with this remarkable woman who had found courage to begin again at 49, pretense seemed pointless. Fear of disappointment, I suppose, I admitted. Both giving and receiving it. It's safer to document beauty than to risk creating something that might fail. Eleanor considered this. In the garden, we call that fear of planting, when you keep the seeds in packets rather than risking them in the ground. She smiled. But seeds in packets never grow, never flower, never become what they were meant to be. A shooting star traced a brief, brilliant path across the night sky above us, there and gone in a heartbeat, but magnificent in its fleeting journey. Maybe it's time we both planted some seeds that scare us, I suggested. Eleanor's hand found mine in the darkness, her gardener's fingers strong and certain against my photographer's grip. I think, she said quietly, we already have. We sat together as the moon continued its arc across the sky, two people at crossroads of growth and change, finding unexpected connection in a garden that was itself in transformation. Tomorrow would bring the challenges of the railway garden restoration, the continuing navigation of Eleanor and Vivian's healing relationship, the community collaborations with all their complexity. But tonight, in the peace of the night garden, possibilities opened like night-blooming flowers, unexpected, fragrant, and perfectly timed. I'm 49, Eleanor whispered, almost to herself. And I'm finally learning that the most beautiful gardens are the ones where you can't tell where the cultivated ends and the wild begins. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first hints of rose and gold, we continued our quiet conversation about gardens and grief, art and growth, the courage to begin again. And somewhere in those honest exchanges, something rare and precious took root between us. A connection as natural and necessary as sun following rain. The garden witnessed it all, holding our stories in its soil, reflecting our possibilities, in every unfurling leaf. After all, that's what gardens do best. Provide space for both endings and beginnings, for both memory and hope, for the delicate, persistent miracle of growth. I never thought rediscovering an old garden shed could unearth so many secrets, but that's exactly what happened 3 months into our railway garden restoration project. As autumn painted Maplewood in fiery hues, and crisp mornings gave way to golden afternoons perfect for outdoor work. Eleanor stood before the weathered, wooden structure, hands on her hips, surveying what most would consider a lost cause. The small shed was nearly hidden beneath a tangle of wild grapevines, its roof sagging dangerously, windows clouded with decades of grime. Most reasonable people would have demolished it and started fresh. Eleanor Winters was not always reasonable. It has good bones, she declared, circling the structure with a critical eye. Handcrafted joinery, old-growth cedar siding. They don't build like this anymore. Vivian, who had extended her visit into a semi-permanent stay, examined the shed with more pragmatic concern. The foundation is shifting, Mom, and that roof won't make it through another winter. So we shore it up, Eleanor replied with the calm certainty that had become her trademark. This shed was your father's first project here. Before the garden, before the society. Just James, with a hammer and a vision. That settled it. The shed restoration became our priority, with a rotating crew of volunteers carefully dismantling, salvaging, and reconstructing under Eleanor and Vivian's guidance. I documented the process, capturing the transformation from neglected ruin to something with purpose and character. Much like the garden itself, and perhaps its caretaker as well. On a particularly beautiful October afternoon, I was photographing Theo and his classmates painting the newly repaired shed door when Eleanor called me over to where she and Vivian were sorting through items recovered from inside. "Look at this," she said, holding up a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen from years of humidity but still intact. James's original garden journal. I thought it was lost. The three of us gathered around a makeshift table as Eleanor carefully turned the pages. Inside were meticulous notes, sketches of garden layouts, pressed specimens, and philosophical musings about the relationship between people and plants. James Winters had been not just a gardener, but a visionary who saw the restoration of land as a pathway to restoring human connection. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, her voice softening as she read. "A garden is never just what you plant. It's about the space you create for unexpected growth, for surprise, for the wild and unplanned beauty that emerges between your careful intentions." I watched her face as she read her late husband's words, the complex emotions playing across, features that had grown more expressive in recent months. There was grief there still, but no longer raw and defensive. Now it existed alongside joy, purpose, and a hard-won peace. "He would be proud," Vivian said quietly. "Of the garden, of the society's revival, of you." Eleanor closed the journal, gently. "I spent too long being afraid of his legacy, afraid I couldn't carry it forward properly." She looked around at the bustling activity throughout the garden. Volunteers planting fall crops, building new structures, teaching children about composting. But legacies aren't meant to be carried alone. They're meant to be shared, adapted, allowed to evolve. As if to underscore her point, Clark arrived with his environmental club, proudly carrying a newly constructed bat house they'd researched and built themselves, an addition James had never envisioned, but that perfectly complemented his ecological principles. We continued exploring the shed's contents, discovering garden tools with handmade handles, jars of heirloom seeds carefully labeled in James's handwriting, and maps of the original garden layout. But the most significant find came when Theo, who had appointed himself official explorer of interesting things, pried up a loose floorboard and discovered a metal box hidden beneath. "Buried treasure," he exclaimed, eyes wide with excitement. The box contained no gold or jewels, but something equally precious. Dozens of letters exchanged between James and Eleanor in the garden's early days, along with photographs, sketches, and a detailed proposal for what they had called the Healing Networks Initiative, an ambitious plan to create interconnected community gardens throughout the region. "This was our dream project," Eleanor explained as we examined the papers spread across the garden table, "to create not just isolated gardens, but a connected system of green spaces that would form corridors for wildlife, walking paths for people, and a shared resource for neighborhoods." Vivian studied the maps with growing excitement. "This could still work," she said. "Professional assessment merging with personal passion. With updated design principles and some digital mapping tools, we could adapt this for today's urban planning standards." Eleanor looked at her daughter with a mixture of surprise and pride. "You'd want to take this on? It's ambitious." "I learned to dream big from the best," Vivian replied with a smile. "Besides, I've been thinking about relocating my practice. Seattle has plenty of landscape architects. Maplewood could use one who understands its history." The significance of this casual statement, Vivian considering moving back permanently, hung in the air like the scent of autumn leaves. Eleanor didn't comment directly, but I noticed her hands steady themselves against the table, as if anchoring herself against a wave of emotion. Later that evening, as sunset painted the garden in amber and gold, the three of us sat on the newly restored shed's porch, drinking hot cider and watching volunteers wrap up the day's work. The transformation of the railway garden over the past months had been remarkable. Pathways cleared and rebuilt, invasive species removed, native plantings established, community plots allocated, and education programs initiated. What had been neglected and nearly lost was now vibrant with new life and purpose. "6-month review with the council is coming up soon," I observed, capturing a final photograph of children collecting fallen leaves for the compost pile. "We'll be ready," Eleanor said with quiet confidence. "The garden is already serving the community again. Even Reynolds has become a supporter. Indeed, the developer had become an unexpected ally, helping secure additional funding and bringing corporate volunteer groups to assist with larger projects. His expertise with city regulations had proven invaluable for navigating permits and zoning requirements. It's not just about saving one garden anymore, Vivian added. It's about reimagining how urban spaces can function. She pulled out her tablet, showing us conceptual drawings she'd been developing that integrated the Healing Networks initiative with modern green infrastructure approaches. Look at how we could connect the railway garden to the elementary school, grounds, the senior center, and eventually the riverfront park. As they discussed the possibilities, I observed the easy flow of their conversation, the way they built on each other's ideas, respected different perspectives, and shared a fundamental understanding of how landscapes shape human experience. The mother-daughter relationship had healed alongside the garden, growing into something new that honored its roots while establishing fresh connections. My phone buzzed with a message from my agent in New York, a prestigious conservation magazine. Interested in my photo documentation of the railway garden restoration, they wanted a full photo essay with accompanying narrative for their spring issue. "That's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed when I shared the news. "Your work deserves recognition." "Our work," I corrected. "I couldn't have captured this story without being part of it." That night, walking back to Eleanor's house under a canopy of stars, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had changed since that chance delivery of garden tools. My photography had evolved from disconnected assignments to deeply engaged documentary work. My solitary existence had expanded to include a community of passionate, purpose-driven people. And most significantly, my heart had opened to possibilities I'd long kept at a safe distance. Eleanor and I walked side by side, comfortable in the evening silence. Our hands occasionally brushed against each other, small, electric moments of connection that neither of us rushed to define. "I've been thinking," she said as we reached her garden gate, its weathered wood now adorned with a hand-carved compass rose emblem, "about what happens after." After? After the council review. After the immediate restoration work is complete. She paused, looking up at the night sky. After we've saved what needed saving. I understood her question beneath the question. What happens to us? This unexpected partnership, this tentative growing connection, when the immediate purpose that brought us together evolves into something else. "I think," I said carefully, "that's when the real growth begins. Gardens need tending long after they're established. They're never really finished." She smiled, recognizing her own wisdom reflected back. James used to say something similar, about relationships. That the most beautiful ones are never static. They keep evolving, surprising you with new blooms just when you think you've seen it all. We stood at her doorstep, the moment stretched between us like a garden path waiting to be explored. Then Eleanor did something unexpected. She reached up and touched my face with gardener's hands that had grown more gentle with each passing day. "I'm 49, she said with quiet certainty. "And I'm finally learning that second chances don't look like first ones. They're better because they're planted in deeper soil." That night, beneath a canopy of stars, something shifted between us. A seed that had been carefully tended through months of working side by side, finally breaking through to the light. The day of the council review arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself wanted to showcase the railway garden at its best. Eleanor wore a simple dress the color of sage, a pendant made from a polished stone from the garden stream, and an expression of calm confidence that belied the stakes of the day. The garden had been prepared like an honored guest arriving for dinner, pathways swept, educational signage installed, autumn plantings neatly mulched, and the newly restored shed transformed into a welcoming education center. Volunteers positioned themselves throughout the space, ready to guide council members and explain different features. "No matter what happens today," Eleanor told the gathered community before the council arrived, "we've already succeeded. This garden is alive again, not just with plants, but with purpose and people." She looked around at the diverse group, school children, retirees, business owners, environmentalists, and even former skeptics like Mrs. Patterson. "You've all helped write a new chapter for this space." The council's arrival brought a flurry of activity as Vivian led the official tour, professionally highlighting the garden's features, while volunteers demonstrated ongoing programs I documented it all, capturing the impressed expressions as council members discovered the children's sensory garden, the veterans' therapeutic horticulture program, the community food production area, and the native plant demonstration plots. Eleanor moved through the space with grace, answering questions and sharing stories, but also stepping back to let others, particularly the children and new gardeners, explain their projects and experiences. She had become a true leader, one who empowered others rather than needing to control every outcome. Council Chair Atkins, who had been the most skeptical 6 months earlier, paused beside a newly established pollinator garden buzzing with late-season activity. "Ms. Winters," she said thoughtfully, "when you presented your proposal, I honestly expected we'd be revisiting the development option today. This transformation is remarkable." Eleanor smiled. The garden was always here, beneath the neglect. It just needed people to believe in it again. "Including you?" the chairwoman asked perceptively. "Especially me." Eleanor acknowledged with characteristic honesty. "Sometimes we need to be reminded of what matters." The official decision, delivered in the newly restored garden shed that now served as an education center, was unanimous. The railway garden would remain a protected community space, with expanded funding for its educational programs and inclusion in the city's green infrastructure planning. As the council members departed and the community erupted in celebration, I searched for Eleanor amidst the hugs and congratulations. I found her in a quiet corner of the garden, seated on a bench, beside a Japanese maple blazing with autumn color. "Not joining the celebration?" I asked, sitting beside her. "Just taking a moment," she replied, "to remember how far we've come." I followed her gaze across the garden, comparing the vibrant, purpose-filled space before us with the neglected tangle we'd encountered months earlier. The transformation went beyond the physical. It was evident in the children confidently explaining composting to adults, in former strangers now working as partners, in Eleanor herself. "You made this happen," I said. She shook her head. "We all did. That's the lesson I needed to relearn. Gardens aren't solo projects. They're collaborative conversations between people and nature." She turned to face me, eyes clear and direct. Just like the best relationships. The autumn light caught in her silver-streaked hair, illuminating her face with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. In that moment, I saw Eleanor Winters wholly, her strength and vulnerability, her wisdom and her continuing growth. Her past honors and future possibilities all integrated into the remarkable woman beside me. "I have something for you," I said, reaching into my bag to retrieve a hand-bound book. An advance copy of the magazine feature. They rushed it for today. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside were my photographs documenting the garden's transformation over the past 6 months. Not just the physical restoration, but the human connections that had flourished alongside the plants. Interwoven with the images were stories from community members, children's artwork, planting records, and ecological observations. "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning pages slowly. "You've captured everything that matters." "Not quite everything," I said, turning to the final spread. A photograph I'd taken without her knowledge one evening, as sunset painted the garden in gold. In it, Eleanor stood amidst towering sunflowers, face tilted upward in an expression of pure joy and possibility. Beneath it was a quote from James's recovered journal. "The true gardener plants not just seeds, but hope. An enduring belief that tomorrow can be more beautiful than today." Eleanor traced the words with her fingertip, tears gathering but not falling. "He would have loved what's happening here," she said softly. "Not just with the garden, but with all of us, growing in unexpected ways." As if on cue, Vivian approached, with Mr. Reynolds and 2 representatives from neighboring communities who were interested in the Healing Networks initiative. Eleanor rose to join them, squeezing my hand briefly before stepping back into her role as visionary and guide. I watched her move through the garden she had once hidden within, now confidently leading others through its pathways. The woman who had greeted my compliment about her chaotic garden with stunned disbelief now stood at the center of a flourishing community she had helped rebuild. Later that evening, after the celebration had wound down and volunteers departed, a smaller gathering assembled on Eleanor's back porch. Vivian and her newly arrived partner from Seattle, Clark, and his environmental club co-president, Theo, and his mother, Grace from the Garden Society, and a few others who had become central to the garden's renaissance. Under strings of soft lights, surrounded by the autumn garden's fading beauty, we shared a meal harvested largely from the railway garden itself. Eleanor, seated at the head of the table, raised a glass of homemade elderberry wine. To growth, she toasted simply. In gardens, and in ourselves. As conversations flowed around us, Eleanor leaned closer to me. I've been offered the director position for the expanded railway garden program, she confided, with Vivian as the landscape architect for the Healing Networks initiative. That's perfect, I said. Will you accept? She nodded. It feels right. Honoring James's vision, while creating something new. She hesitated, but it will mean being very public again, after years of hiding in my own garden. You're ready, I assured her. More than ready. And you? She asked. The magazine wants you to document community garden initiatives across the country. That would mean traveling, being away for stretches of time. The question beneath the question hung between us. What did this mean for us? For this careful, beautiful connection we'd been nurturing? I've been thinking about that, I said. About how gardeners approach distance and time. They understand that some seasons require separation. Seeds need darkness before they reach for light. Certain plants need winter's cold before spring's awakening. I took her hand, weathered and strong from months of garden work. But they always come back to tend what matters most. Eleanor's smile deepened, reaching her eyes and softening the last traces of the defensive solitude I'd encountered months ago. I'm 49, she said, the phrase now carrying layers of meaning between us. And I'm finally learning that the best gardens have both deep roots and room to spread. As the evening progressed, I watched Eleanor move among her guests, confident yet humble, focused yet open to joy. The transformation from the woman who had declared she hadn't heard a compliment in years to this engaged, purposeful leader was as remarkable as any garden restoration. Later, after guests had departed and Vivian had tactfully retreated to give us privacy, Eleanor and I walked through her home garden under a rising harvest moon. The space that had once been her hiding place had evolved alongside its caretaker, still, beautiful in its controlled chaos, but now featuring openings and pathways, places where visitors were welcomed rather than kept at bay. We stopped beside a newly planted section where Eleanor had been experimenting with moon garden principles, white flowers and silver-leaved plants that glowed in the darkness. I've been wondering, she said, her voice thoughtful in the night. What would have happened if you hadn't made that joke about my chaotic garden that first day? I'd probably still be watching conspiracy videos about birds not being real, I admitted. She laughed, a free, uninhibited sound that had become more frequent as the months passed. And I'd still be hiding behind my overgrown hedges, pretending I didn't need anyone. The universe has interesting ways of bringing the right elements together, I observed. Any good gardener knows that certain plants grow better in combination than alone. Companion planting, she nodded, creating relationships where both species thrive because of what they give each other. She turned to face me fully in the moonlight. I've spent 3 years shutting out compliments, connections, possibilities, building walls instead of bridges. And now? I asked, echoing a question we'd shared many times through our months together. Now I'm ready to grow differently, she said, moving closer until I could see the moonlight reflected in her eyes. To plant new seeds, even the ones that scare me, especially those. In the quiet garden, surrounded by plants that had witnessed our unlikely beginning and gradual transformation, Eleanor rose on tiptoe and kissed me, a gesture as natural and necessary as rain after drought. Her gardener's hands, strong and certain, found mine in the darkness. I'm 49, she whispered against my lips, and I'm finally hearing every compliment you've been giving me, with your words, your actions, your presence, since the day we met. The garden around us seemed to hum with approval, crickets singing, night-blooming flowers releasing their fragrance, the distant call of an owl marking its territory. This, too, was part of the garden's purpose, to witness beginnings, to hold stories, to provide space for both endings and new growth. We walked back toward the house hand in hand, planning tomorrow's tasks, discussing Vivian's expanded garden network proposal, debating the merits of different composting systems, ordinary conversations made extraordinary by the journey that had brought us together. I thought about the first time I'd seen Eleanor's garden, the beautiful chaos that had caught my attention and prompted the compliment that changed everything. How appropriate that our story had begun there, in a space where structure and wildness coexisted, where careful intention met unexpected growth, where beauty emerged from both planning and surprise. As we reached her porch, Eleanor paused, looking back at the moonlit garden as if seeing it with new eyes. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think gardens are a lot like love. They require patience, forgiveness, regular attention, and absolute faith in things you cannot yet see." I smiled, drawing her closer. "And both are worth every moment of care they demand. There are certain images that stay with you. A garden pathway opening toward unexpected light, silver threads in dark hair caught by the setting sun, hands that have tended soil now reaching toward human connection." I'd captured thousands of photographs over our months together, documenting the revival of a garden and its caretaker. But some moments were meant to be lived rather than framed. This was one of them, standing on the threshold between past and future, between solitude and partnership, between fear and hope. With Eleanor beside me, I stepped forward into the home and life she was no longer afraid to share, carrying the simple truth we'd both finally embraced: that the most beautiful gardens, like the most beautiful lives, are never finished. They're always growing, adapting, surprising us with new possibilities just when we think we've seen it all. And sometimes all it takes to start that journey is a simple compliment about a beautiful garden, offered to someone who hasn't heard one in years. 1 year later, spring in Maplewood arrived with a flourish of color and celebration, as the community gathered for the first anniversary of the Railway Garden's official preservation. The once neglected space had transformed beyond anyone's expectations, becoming a vibrant hub that pulsed with life and purpose throughout all seasons. I captured the moment from the newly constructed observation deck. Hundreds of people moving through flowering pathways, children planting sunflower seeds in the educational area, elderly veterans tending the therapeutic garden beds, chefs from local restaurants, including Diane's now famous farm-to-table cafe, harvesting early spring greens. The garden had become exactly what Eleanor and James had envisioned years ago, a living connection between nature and community, between past wisdom and future possibility. "Getting the perfect shot?" Eleanor's voice came from behind me, warm and familiar. I turned to find her carrying 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea, her silver-streaked hair now worn in a confident, shorter style that framed her face beautifully. The past year had softened some of her edges while strengthening her core. She moved with the easy authority of someone who had found her rightful place in the world. "Just trying to capture the impossible," I replied, accepting the tea. "How do you photograph a miracle in progress?" She laughed, that free and uninhibited sound that still made my heart skip. "Is that what we're calling community gardening these days? A miracle? When you consider where we started?" "Absolutely." We stood side by side, watching the celebration unfold beneath us. The railway garden had not only been preserved, but had expanded, becoming the first node in what was now called the Maplewood Green Network, Vivian's ambitious adaptation of her parents' original Healing Networks initiative. Already, 3 additional community gardens had been established across the city, connected by newly planted greenways and walking paths. Eleanor's gaze fell on her daughter, who was currently guiding a group of urban planning students through the garden's innovative water conservation systems. Vivian had indeed relocated her landscape architecture practice to Maplewood, bringing with her both professional expertise and a renewed relationship with her mother. They worked together nearly every day, their complementary strengths creating a powerful partnership that honored James's legacy while pushing boldly into new territory. "Sometimes I still can't believe she came back," Eleanor said softly. "That we found our way to each other again." "The garden brought you both home," I observed. Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's funny. For 3 years after James died, I thought home was something I had to protect and contain. A private refuge against loss." She gestured toward the thriving community below us. "Now I understand that home grows stronger when you open the gate." My camera captured a perfect moment. Theo, now a year older and self-appointed junior garden docent, earnestly explaining composting, to the mayor, while Oscar the cat supervised from a sunny bench. Beside them, Clark conducted interviews for the documentary that had evolved from his school project into an award-winning film about urban renewal through community gardening. "Your exhibition opens next week," Eleanor reminded me, a note of pride in her voice. "Are you nervous?" The question made me smile. A year ago, I had been a freelance photographer drifting between assignments, capturing others' stories while keeping a safe distance from my own. Now my work documenting the railway garden restoration had evolved into a traveling exhibition sponsored by the National Arts Foundation. Cultivating community, the healing power of shared gardens. Terrified, I admitted, but the good kind of terrified. Eleanor squeezed my hand, understanding perfectly. We had both learned to embrace the fertile tension between fear and growth, finding our greatest expansions on the edge of comfort. The past year had brought professional renaissance for both of us. Eleanor now directed the Maplewood Green Network, a position that combined her organizational brilliance with her deep horticultural knowledge. I divided my time between documenting community garden initiatives nationwide and teaching photography, workshops for at-risk youth in the Railway Gardens Education Center. Our life together had developed its own natural rhythm, periods of togetherness balanced with the independent pursuits that fed our individual passions. Like the garden itself, our relationship thrived through a balance of structure and freedom, planned cultivation and wild surprise. "There's Mr. Reynolds," Eleanor pointed out, indicating the developer who had once proposed replacing the garden with a parking structure. His latest project incorporated vertical gardens and community growing spaces on the rooftop. Vivian's influence is spreading. Indeed, the developer had become an unexpected ally, gradually incorporating sustainable practices into his building designs and serving on the advisory board for the Green Network. It was yet another example of how the garden had sparked transformation far beyond its physical boundaries. "Have you seen Grace's new apprentices?" I asked, gesturing toward the herb garden where the Elder Garden Society member was demonstrating proper harvesting techniques to a group of teenagers. 3 of them were part of the juvenile diversion program. Eleanor nodded. "The judge told me their community service hours here have been more effective than any other intervention they've tried. Something about growing things changes their perspective." We made our way down from the observation deck to join the celebration, stopping frequently as community members greeted Eleanor with updates, questions, and expressions of gratitude. She moved through these interactions with natural grace, remembering names and personal details, offering guidance without imposing control, a true leader who empowered others to flourish. Near the garden entrance, Mrs. Patterson, whose own front yard had gradually incorporated more native plants and fewer chemically dependent roses, was organizing the refreshment table with military precision. "Eleanor, dear," she called, "should we serve the elderberry punch now or wait until the mayor's speech?" "Trust your judgment," Eleanor replied warmly. "You're the hospitality expert." The simple response, deferring to another's expertise rather than needing to control every detail, represented how profoundly Eleanor had changed since I'd first met her. The woman who had once guarded her solitary garden like a fortress now thrived in collaboration, finding strength in shared purpose rather than isolated perfection. As the afternoon progressed, I continued documenting the celebration, children's faces illuminated with discovery, elders sharing wisdom, strangers becoming friends over shared gardening tips. My camera captured the visible manifestations of the garden's impact, but I knew the most profound transformations were often invisible. The healing of old wounds, the reconnection of community bonds, the rediscovery of purpose. The mayor's speech praised the railway garden as a model for urban renewal, citing improved neighborhood metrics in everything from property values to public health outcomes. Eleanor accepted the commendation with characteristic humility, immediately, redirecting credit to the community members who had made it possible. "Gardens teach us that no one succeeds alone," she told the gathered crowd. "Every bloom depends on a network of support, sun and soil, water and pollinators, and yes, human hands that believe in possibility." She paused, her gaze finding mine, in the crowd. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up day after day and tend what matters." Later, as sunset painted the garden in amber and gold, the celebration transitioned to a community dinner served at long tables, set among flowering fruit trees. Children ran with solar lanterns, creating dancing patterns of light as musicians played acoustic instruments beneath the restored garden pergola. Eleanor and I found a quiet moment at the garden's edge, where a memorial bench had been installed honoring James Winters. His journal, restored and preserved, now resided in a weatherproof display in the education center, inspiring new generations with his vision of gardens as spaces of healing and connection. "He would be amazed," I said, watching Eleanor trace the carved inscription, "In every garden, a universe of possibility." "Yes and no," she replied thoughtfully. "James always saw the potential, even when others couldn't. He believed in what gardens could do for people, and what people could do for each other when given the right environment to grow." She smiled. In that way, nothing about this would surprise him. He was just waiting for the rest of us to catch up to his vision. As twilight deepened, Vivian joined us, bringing a blueprint tube and a bottle of sparkling cider. "Official approval came through today," she announced, uncorking the bottle. "The Riverside connection for the Green Network. Construction starts next month." Eleanor's eyes widened. "That's the missing link. With that section complete, we'll have a continuous green corridor from the eastern neighborhoods all the way to the western district. 5 miles of connected gardens, natural areas, and walking paths," Vivian confirmed, pouring the cider into compostable cups. "The full realization of what you and Dad envisioned 15 years ago. We toasted beneath the emerging stars, 3 people connected by a garden that had become so much more than plants and pathways. It was a living testament to resilience, to second chances, to the power of showing up even when the ground seems barren." As night settled fully over the celebration, fireflies emerged like living stars among the garden beds. Children chased them with delighted squeals while adults relaxed into the magic of a community gathering that felt both ancient and new. Humans coming together in green spaces, sharing food and stories, finding connection in a fragmented world. Eleanor and I walked hand in hand through the railway garden that had brought us together, past the herb spiral where we'd first worked side by side, beneath the arbor where we'd sheltered during summer storms, alongside the children's garden, where Theo had discovered his passion for teaching others. "Sometimes I still can't believe all this grew from a casual compliment about my chaotic garden," Eleanor mused. "One small moment that changed everything." "The garden was always there," I reminded her, "waiting for someone to see its beauty again, including you." She stopped at the garden gate, not the original weathered entrance where I'd first delivered those garden tools, but a new community-built structure featuring hand-carved panels depicting the garden's seasonal cycles. A small plaque beside it read, "Every garden begins with a single seed." "I turn 50 next month," Eleanor said, her voice calm and clear in the evening air. "And I've finally learned that the most beautiful parts of life are never what we plan. They're what we discover when our careful designs give way to something wilder and more wonderful." I thought of all we had cultivated together over the past year, not just gardens and community projects, but trust, partnership, and a love that had taken root in the most unexpected soil. Like any good gardener, we had learned to balance patience with action, to trust natural processes while providing thoughtful structure, to cherish both the planned and the spontaneous elements that made our shared life thrive. "To 50 years of beautiful chaos," I toasted, drawing her close. "And beyond," she agreed, her gardener's hands, strong, capable, and infinitely gentle, finding their home in mine. Above us, stars wheeled in ancient patterns while beneath our feet, seeds slept in dark soil, preparing for their moment of emergence. Around us, a community celebrated its reconnection to the earth and to each other. And between us flowed the quiet certainty that some gardens, whether of plants or possibilities, flourish most abundantly when tended by hearts that have learned to grow together. The railway garden continued its seasonal cycles of death and rebirth, its boundaries expanding and its roots deepening with each passing year. But its greatest achievement could never be measured in square footage or harvest yields. It grew in the transformed lives of those it touched, in renewed connections between neighbors, in the healing of old wounds, in the courage to begin again, after loss, And it all began with a simple observation about a beautiful garden, offered to someone who hadn't heard such words in years. Proof that sometimes the smallest seeds, planted in exactly the right moment, can grow into something more magnificent than anyone could have imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.